I want to turn it over to Jay Solomon from the Wall Street Journal and just say this about Jay. Jay is one of those rare reporters who actually drives conversations in Washington on foreign policy, and he's going to moderate our first panel. Jay?
Great, thanks. Let me just introduce the panel to begin with. Mr. Schanzer was just briefly mentioned. He's the Vice President of, he's the Vice President for Research at FDD. He's a former analyst at the Treasury Department looking at countering financial illicit money, and has written extensively about Hamas and Turkey in particular in recent years, and has done a lot of interesting stuff on how Iran has used Turkey as a money laundering operation. Next to him is Tom Joscelyn, who is an editor at the Long War Journal and a senior fellow at FDD, and has been doing a lot of writing in recent months, recent weeks, on the links between the Iranian government and al-Qaeda elements, and kind of raising the questions, can the U.S. really cooperate in Iran when it has basically been playing footsie with some of these extremist groups. And on my far end is Gretchen Peters, a former television journalist who spent a lot of time in Central and South Asia, particularly Pakistan. She is now a senior fellow at the George Mason University, and has kind of her focus for many years was narco-trafficking. She wrote a book on the threat called Seeds of Terror, and now she's heavily focused on Africa. So we have a great panel to look at today's issues. We're at a very interesting time, I think, because financial warfare has kind of really emerged in the past 5 or 6 years as a key component in our national security apparatus, whether it's on the Iran issues, Syria, Russia. It's kind of much more a center of our national security tools. So I think we should kind of use that as the backdrop to go into our conversation. The main focus is kind of the future threats of illicit finance in Africa and Iran, but I'd like to start, I'm sorry, in Middle East in general, but I'd like to start the discussion just kind of raising the question is, where are we now as far as the threats of illicit money, and how effective do our panelists think the use of financial sanctions and financial warfare to some extent has been as far as countering Iran, Syria, ISIS? Has it been effective, or are we starting to see these terrorist groups, these kind of rogue actors move and find ways to evolve around these threats? So maybe, Jonathan, you can start with that.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jay, and thanks to all of you for attending what is a special day here for us at FDD. In answer to your question, Jay, I think, look, with the issue of Iran, the effort that has been undertaken by the United States Congress, by the international community, and some of the tools that have been developed by the U.S. Treasury in particular have made sanctions particularly effective. With Iran, I think of one tool in particular, and that was removing many Iranian banks from the SWIFT system. That really delivered a crippling blow to the Iranians, and likely was one of the factors that brought them to the negotiating table. There are, of course, other sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and its allies on refined petroleum, petrochemicals, gold, et cetera. Some of these have been, of course, repealed by the JPOA. And one of the things that I think about, we all think about here at FDD, is what will happen if and when a deal is struck, how to maintain sanctions on Iran for its other illicit activity, for its support of Hezbollah, for its support of Hamas, for its violations of human rights. How does one maintain that architecture while also repealing sanctions to reward potential compliance on the nuclear front? Syria is a very different story. You mentioned the Syria sanctions. They have been far less effective, and that is primarily because the Syrians have been unplugged from the formal financial sector, something of a basket case economically, and I would say the same holds for Sudan, where we've had sanctions for quite some time, and so we've just not had that kind of an impact. Maybe just one other note, looking at the way that sanctions have been imposed, sometimes those sanctions truly work when you designate one person or one entity or one charity, and you can potentially freeze assets, or you can start to block entities from the formal financial sector. But there are other ways that we have seen, and more recently I think about the example of Hamas. Hamas is not in trouble because of the sanctions that we've imposed or the Israelis have imposed, but because of something that's somewhat surprising, and that is that the Egyptians have just simply shut down the tunnels. And it's one of the more amazing ways that I've seen the illicit finance flows be closed up. And it's been through very physical means. And so there's lots of different ways to skin the cat, so to speak, and so we live in interesting times.
Gretchen, maybe you can weigh in on the same topic, looking at it from whether it's the Taliban or how it's impacted al-Qaeda in the part of the world you looked at, whether it's in South Asia or Africa.
I mean, I think al-Qaeda in Pakistan has come under severe pressure and sustained attention since 2001, and that has impacted their capacity to operate. But sanctions don't work as well, and I've seen that with other actors and other networks in the AFPAC region, if there isn't that type of sustained focus. One of the problems we've seen, particularly with the Haqqani network that I worked on, is this perception among many policymakers that sanctions are the end of the story, that once you've sanctioned a network or designated an individual within the network, that's it, they're done, they're finished. And in fact, there needs to be more understanding that this sanction is like an arrest warrant. It's the beginning of the story. And this is the tool that gives investigators, law enforcement officials, the tools they need, or the authorities they need to go out and track down that network's assets, real estate holdings, the businesses, and go after them. When the Haqqani network was finally sanctioned or designated a terrorist network in whatever year that was, a couple years ago, I wrote a 6 or 8 page. I was working as a consultant to the DoD, to CENTCOM, and I wrote about a 6 or 8 page strategy, which is now somewhere gathering cyber dust on a classified database somewhere, on how to go about dismantling the Haqqani's capacity to operate in the financial system and the global trade system. And it was never acted on. I mean, we never did anything on it. Years later, I was asked again to come and speak to military and intelligence officials about what to do about the Haqqanis. And I said, didn't you guys read my report? I wrote it 3 years ago. No one had done a thing. So there were sustained efforts to go after individuals within the Haqqani network, picking them off in drone strikes, that kind of thing. But to attack a network as a whole network, as a business entity, in other words, that's something the focus can get lost on that quite quickly if it isn't a real strategic priority.
Jonathan, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Gretchen, you raised one point that really hit home, and that is this question of what happens after someone has been designated or an entity has been designated. A trend that I've been noting over the last year or two has been that more follow-up needs to be done on designations after they take place. And I don't mean just following up on assets, but just keeping research current. Because when I was at the Treasury Department, it would take 6 months to a year, for example, to pull together an evidentiary package where we would have sufficient evidence to be able to designate someone. And you had to go through a laborious process where you go through one layer of lawyer after another, Treasury, then State, then Justice Department, and then an interagency process. And by the time you're done, you had quite a bit of gray hair. What's amazing is that generally that's where the process stops. Mm-hmm. And you don't continue to compile that dossier to make sure that it remains current. And the result is that there are those who are coming back to the U.S. government and appealing those designations. And what they're saying is, you don't have any information on me, so how can you keep me designated? Well, of course, they met criteria in the first place. They were deemed terrorists by the United States government back then. But what happens over those 10 years? And so there is a real follow-up issue that I think we do need to address.
One issue I'm very interested right now, and Tom, maybe you can address this, is there's been so much focus on this financial campaign on Iran. It's kind of the textbook case and like a high water mark. If there's kind of an agreement in the next couple of months, it's seen as kind of weak, and then the sanctions are kind of repealed, do you think history will kind of show this was kind of a phase where these sanctions were really effective because no one really knew how to react to them, but then once the Iranian deal was kind of over, that the incredible impact these sanctions had kind of waned, and this will just be seen as kind of a blip on the screen?
Well, I think that's possible, but of course sanctions always are coupled with diplomacy, and sort of it's a 1-2 punch. The sanctions need the right diplomatic sort of approach in order to maximize their efficacy, and I don't think that we've gotten that in a lot of cases. In fact, you've written some excellent articles about the Obama administration's approach to diplomacy with Iran, and one of the underlying assumptions for those diplomatic efforts is that we can achieve détente or even a de facto alliance against common enemies throughout the Middle East, whether it be the Islamic State in Iraq or Al-Qaeda elsewhere. And that is just a fundamental misreading of the situation in the Middle East. In fact, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, it's actually entirely inconsistent with what State and Treasury have said repeatedly since July 28, 2011 about what Iran is doing on the Sunni side, in particular cooperating with and has a deal with Al-Qaeda that allows Al-Qaeda to move fighters, funds, that sort of thing through Iranian soil. So my conception of how diplomacy should work is that the sanctions are used as a tool, and then you use the daylight that's shined through the Treasury Department, through State Department, and you don't basically try and decouple these things where the nuclear program is one issue and then all of Iran's behavior is something else. I think if you really wanted to have a real sit down at the table, all this has to be on the table. And I think that that's been a fundamental mistake in sort of how this has been approached.
One other issue that's been kind of emerging, particularly since the Russia sanctions, is this perception that, the Chinese or the Russians and the Iranians will set up some parallel financial system, or foreign banks might be a bit more wary of putting money in the U.S. because they think their money could get frozen, or it's no longer a safe haven, and it actually could end up hurting the U.S. financial system in some ways because we've used these sanctions so pervasively. Is that something, Gretchen, maybe you can talk about it first, you think is a real potential threat?
I think it's a potential threat to any organization if it's used pervasively. But I think if it's applied sporadically, if there's the huge delays in the lack of follow-up in designating financial assets, companies, individuals within the networks, that can slow progress in this area. It has to be an efficient process. It really does.
Jonathan, do you think it is a potential risk to our own financial system, the use of these penalties?
I think it is, perhaps not in the immediate future, but certainly something to keep an eye on. It's something that we've been looking at CSIF. For example, right now we're looking at attempts by the Chinese and the Russians to create an alternative to the SWIFT system. They, I think, are really in the early goings, and I don't see a lot of financial institutions being attracted to this new system. But ultimately, if it becomes pervasive enough, then we could see them begin to leverage that system against the United States, much as the US and the Europeans have used it against Iran, for example, in the past, and have threatened to use it against the Russians. And the Russians are incredibly sensitive to this. They have stated very openly that using SWIFT against them would be tantamount to war. And so these are things that we want to continue to watch. We know, I think more broadly, that we have been very effective when it comes to offensive economic warfare. The defensive component of this is something that I think the U.S. strategically needs to be thinking about more and more as our adversaries and foes think about ways to turn the tables on the United States and the financial system that we have leveraged for coercion.
Tom, you want to touch this one?
Yeah, I look at this probably a little differently than most. I think that a lot of what, I agree with everything Jonathan just said, but I think one of the things about this is that when you look at what bad actors do, in terms of the range of weapons they would use against us. A lot of it, we're very much in an asymmetric phase right now, where a lot of the things that they would threaten the U.S. with, whether it be cyber warfare or terrorism or those types of things, these are all tactics that are in the asymmetric sort of realm. And one of the benefits I see to sort of using economic warfare offensively is that you tend to basically expose what the bad actors are doing and shine daylight on that. I think that's a good thing and has all sorts of ramifications for it. But it also flushes out their actions and sort of flushes out their behavior in a way that basically makes it more part of the explicit conversation going forward. So it sort of reveals their hand. And so I think that's an important thing I think is often overlooked, because a lot of times what bad actors are doing is they're trying to basically either limit or counter U.S. influence in ways that are unseen to the naked eye or to journalists or to reporters or the American public. And in going back and forth this way, I think that's an argument we're typically going to win as long as we're pushing forward our values and principles in a way that's consistent with sort of American history.
And when we look forward at the illicit money threats from the Middle East and from Africa, I'm interested in drawing out you guys on some of the issues I know you've been focused on in your own work. Jonathan, like particularly with the Iranian situation, you wrote a lot about how much money the Iranians were laundering through Turkey to tens of billions of dollars. In the past, there's been a lot of focus on the UAE, and that's seemed to be somewhat cleaned up, and other parts. Is Turkey, like, do you think this is like one of the biggest threats now, or is it kind of mainly focused on the Iran issue?
Turkey is what I would probably call a growth industry in our business. How I would describe it is, first of all, that if you were watching in 2012 to 2013, there was what was called the Gas for Gold scheme. And this was at the peak of the Iran sanctions regime, designed to bring the Iranians to the table and to deprive them of hard currency. What the Turks did, rather surprisingly, was they allowed the Iranians to sell them oil and gas, and in return they provided gold. And the gold was then sent to the UAE, so the UAE still remained a significant part of this scheme. And then the cash was then repatriated back to Iran, or the gold itself was brought to Iran. In the end, that totaled something in the realm of $15 billion. It was technically legal according to sanctions. Of course, it violated the spirit of the sanctions regime at the time, and then the U.S. government put a stop to that. Now, what was interesting is that there was a prosecutor's report that was issued in March of last year from Istanbul. And what that report revealed was that $15 billion was probably just the tip of the iceberg. This report alleged that there was an additional 87 billion euro that was being laundered between Turkey and Iran, UAE, China. It was a vast network. It actually, some of the funds went through banks that were supposedly banned through the SWIFT system, and yet were being used for this scheme. We saw classic money laundering techniques, over-invoicing, under-invoicing. There was one case where brown sugar was being sold for roughly $350 a pound. It's quite a deal. But at any rate, in other words, what we saw is there's a huge amount of activity that has gone undocumented in Turkey. The Turks refused to address any of the charges that have been leveled. Now, that all, I should just say that all of that should be somewhat confusing for anyone who's been watching what's been happening in Syria. The Turks have been furious about the Assad regime staying in power, and of course the Iranians are the financial patrons of the Assad regime. So what they're doing is, on the one hand, fighting the Assad regime, and on the other hand, financing it. And so it was this very curious situation, but a lot of questions still remain. And just for just another minute, I should just note that the Iran illicit financial activity in Turkey is just one component of what we're watching. Hamas's headquarters is now in Turkey externally. There are at least 17 different figures, including financiers, 2 or 3 by our count, that are based in Turkey today. And then, of course, there's the border between Turkey and Syria, where there's a huge amount of weapons, cash, fighters flowing across that border. I would now say that that 565-mile border is one of the top jurisdictions of illicit finance today, and it has really just been allowed to continue in a very negative direction. So, in short, Turkey is a growth industry for what we're looking at, but it really needs, I think, a closer look from the folks at Treasury and beyond.
Tom, I know you've been writing a lot about this nexus between the Iranian regime and Al-Qaeda specifics. Could you talk a bit more about this? Because I know there's been a debate probably since 9/11, even earlier, about, okay, the Iranians are a Shiite government. Why would they ever be aligned with a movement that basically wants to fight it? And they are fighting ISIS inside Iraq and inside Syria. Could you just expound a bit more about this? And if there is a financial angle, or is it mainly just kind of logistics?
Well, it's interesting because, this is one of those areas where the assumptions have often trumped the evidence, where people basically assumed the two couldn't collude together, so nobody was looking carefully at the evidence. But when you actually look carefully at the evidence, as people have actually going all the way back to the 1990s under the Clinton administration, and Clinton prosecutors were actually the first ones in their first federal indictment of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to point to the relationship between the Iranian government and Al-Qaeda. The 9/11 Commission did the same thing, looked at the evidence, and there are a number of pages in the Commission's report that deal with that. And now in this age, from July 28, 2011, there have been at least 5 designations by the Treasury Department dealing specifically with this issue. On July 28, 2011, then again on December 22nd of 2011 on forward, where basically what it is that the Iranian regime has a deal with the senior-most levels of Al-Qaeda senior leadership, that allows them to move funds and fighters through Iranian soil. Now, to give you an understanding of how complex and duplicitous all this behavior is, right now in Syria, the Nusra Front, which is a regional branch of Al-Qaeda and answers directly to Al-Qaeda senior leadership, is fighting Assad, is fighting the IRGC, is fighting Hezbollah, is fighting Iran's proxies on a day-to-day basis in Syria. And yet it's the Nusra Front that in particular is receiving this support from Al-Qaeda through Iranian soil, according to the Treasury Department and others. In fact, 2 senior leaders in the Nusra Front previously led the Al-Qaeda network in Iran. So when you look at this behavior, you have to think that there's some calculation that the Iranians are making that we don't fully understand or are not processing when it either comes to our diplomatic efforts or sort of the public commentary on these things. And I think that that's a key point. Now, just to wrap that up into your second question, is there more to this? There absolutely is, because one of the things that the Iranian network, the Al-Qaeda network in Iran, has been doing is bundling funds from Gulf state actors and shipping them through Syria, through Turkey, through Iran, to Al-Qaeda senior leadership in Pakistan, whether it be from Qatar or other nations. And so exposing and putting daylight on that's the type of thing that the U.S. government could and should do, and they have been doing, and then use that to follow up with putting pressure on multiple points of the network. So it's not just about Iran, but it's also about the Gulf states that are being duplicitous in this.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that the U.S. Treasury has been incredibly effective in shedding light on this particular issue. And it really shows that the sanctions regime is so much more than capturing cash. I think we've actually seen real diminishing returns in terms of how much cash we've captured from these various networks and individuals that have been sanctioned by the U.S. government. But Treasury, I think, almost single-handedly has been shedding light on this one particular issue, and it's a head-scratcher for a lot of analysts out there, but Treasury's been dogged on this. I think they really deserve some credit for it.
I mean, it's Treasury and State, and I'll give it to you just to understand the power of what they've been doing. It starts on July 28, 2011 as the first designation of the network. Then on December 22nd, 2011, the State Department issues a $10 million reward for the leader of this Al-Qaeda network in Iran, one of the highest rewards for information leading to his capture of any Al-Qaeda operative. Then in February of 2012, they designate the Ministry of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security in Iran, one of their main intelligence bodies. The MOIS actually oversees and protects Iran's nuclear program. And at the same time, according to the Treasury Department, they're sponsoring Al-Qaeda. And I won't go on and on, but you can go on and on like that for a couple of years where there are all these designations like that.
Thanks. Gretchen, I know you've kind of moved from South Asia more down to Africa, but are looking at very similar trends as far as illicit money, how extremist groups or bad governments are using illicit finance to further their aims. Could you talk to us about some of the trends you're seeing, whether it's the smuggling of endangered species, commodities, trade, just kind of normal trade to mask bad business, and just how corruption is feeding into all this?
I'm doing a couple of projects looking at wildlife trafficking in Africa, in Central Africa, and also in South Africa and Mozambique. And we're looking at the problem from the transport and financial standpoint, as opposed to at the poaching level, which is where most analysis is being done around by conservation groups. So what we're finding is that there are a lot of really bad people involved. It's in the places that I'm working, it's less a case of what we would classically define as terrorist groups funding themselves through wildlife trafficking as it is drug traffickers and other crime networks that have diversified into wildlife because they see an opportunity to make more money. You see very interesting multi-ethnic supply chains that outsource to local actors and facilitators when they need certain activities to take place, and none of it would function without corruption greasing the wheels at every step of the way. Corruption is the biggest scourge to the elephant and the rhino today, and we already shut our project in South Africa down for about 6 months. It took us about 6 months to recover from being shut down, probably by corrupt actors who are trying to protect their own interests.
Does this feed into Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or any of those groups, some of the stuff you're looking at?
We don't have any concrete evidence of Boko Haram in Central Africa yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we find them eventually. In East Africa, I would say it's, I anticipate we will be able to prove shortly that Dawood Ibrahim's network is involved in moving large amounts of wildlife parts along with narcotics that they're trafficking between South Africa and East Africa, the eastern coast of Africa and South Asia, and working in close conjunction with major triads like the 14K.
Great. Well, I'm going to open it up now to Q&A. So I can't see a thing from up here, but if, if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and they'll get you a mic. I really can't see anything back here.
I see a few.
Okay.
That light's like an interrogation light.
Sure, thanks.
I know.
My name is Zach. I'm with an organization called Reboot. A lot of this conversation and the broader analysis that's available is relating to the role of financial networks and financial flows around discrete security issues. But the common conversation thus far seems to be lacking a little bit of a broader systemic view of what it means to intervene in these systems and whether or not our interventions are systematically approaching the right entry points. Two counterpoints to raise for this conversation around that topic. One is, are we looking in the right corners, right?
Yeah.
With recent revelations around HSBC, and just today
Right.
there was a Times article about Jack Straw in England and Rifkin accepting bribes of influence. Those are supposed to be the good actors, right? And we know that there are bad actors with bad intentions. Are we going hard enough against some of these other entry points where clearly there is a nexus of these flows, and perhaps we could have greater legal authority given that they're supposed to be the good guys? So that's one counterpoint. And the other is just to say, what does it mean for us to really be intervening in capital flows writ large? Capital flows are at the heart of globalization's history as we know it. Is this creating yet another point of conflict between global capital and the nation state in an era where we're trying to figure out what the balance of power between those two forces are? So I'd be very interested if this group could talk a little bit more at the systemic level rather than thinking about very discrete security issues. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Who would like to take that one? It's an interesting question.
I can perhaps
Sure.
start. Two things come to mind with your comments, and thank you for them. First is that one of the things that I saw at Treasury is that there was a kind of a rule of thumb, and that was first do no harm, or at least that was the attempt. And of course, intervening in capital flows could, I mean, you can open up Pandora's box, but I think what we saw time and again was a very gradual approach. Much of what Treasury does right now is actually done on a very quiet level, where leaders are met by Treasury officials, where they are warned of some of the risks that are taking place in a given country. I find time and again that Treasury, this was a Stuart Levy initiative where he would go and he would talk time and again to these leaders to try to convince them to halt some of this activity before sanctions are introduced, before harsher measures are introduced. And so I think that has always been the rule of thumb. I think it continues to be. And so when we talk about the actual punitive measures that are taken, that is usually the end result of months of other activity that you're not seeing that's beneath the surface. As for some of the more systemic issues, I think that we are seeing a good faith effort on the part of financial institutions here in the United States as well as Europe. A lot of my former colleagues at the Treasury Department have gone on to work for financial institutions, making a good living now, where they are looking for some of these problems. They're working with OFAC, they're working with other financial integrity organizations to make sure that these banks are in compliance. And so, I think we are seeing that good faith effort. I think there are some things that I would want to think about in terms of the policy choices that we make here in this country. I think one example that I think about a lot is the question of corruption and our support here in this country for corrupt regimes. A prime example of that is the support that we've provided to the Palestinian Authority over the years. And not because the Palestinian Authority is so horrible in its policy choices, but ultimately our support for the PA led to the election of Hamas. The corruption that the PA had engaged in over the years had, I think, reached a saturation point for the average Palestinian. In 2006, elections were held. Hamas ran on a counter-corruption ticket, and that appealed to the Palestinian people. And so you get a sense of how some of our policy choices have maybe led to some unintended consequences. And so we need to continue to reassess our policies as we think about some of these systemic problems.
Yeah, anyone else want to chime in on that?
The area where I think there needs to, or the issue of looking in the right corners, I do agree with the commentator's comment about being more watchful among our banks, and I do also agree with what John has said about the banking system trying to clean up its act. But that's certainly an area where we need to remain very vigilant. I think what I've seen more than anything else out in the world that is misunderstood or just simply not understood at all is the use of trade-based money laundering to move billions and billions of dollars of illicit funds and to launder it. You just see it absolutely everywhere. And I think one of the ways that the US government, the World Bank, and other organizations that are trying to fight these problems can help is to help governments computerize, regularize, harmonize their mechanisms for recording trade, and to make it harder for illicit actors to move, refrigerator compressors, used tires, gold scrap through the system without it being, without anomalies popping up that for people like us to catch on to. Because right now, tracking that issue is extremely tedious. Almost as tedious as trying to explain what trade-based money laundering is to a high-level policymaker. That's an even harder task. And how you connect the guy in Sharjah, with a tiny shop that's somehow selling $14 million worth of used car parts every month. How you connect him, Khorassani used spare parts and autos, how you connect him to Mullah Omar. It's not going to be a simple connection. It's going to be circuitous. And too few people understand how that system works. And it's designed that way. It's designed to hide in the cracks. But too few people understand it. And it is in my opinion, is the most common way that illicit actors use to slide funds through the system, to hide them, to launder them, to move money into position to launch operations, everything. And it's deeply misunderstood.
Thanks. Tom, do you want to?
I would just offer a defense of specifics and specificity. I think that that's a good thing in these conversations because you're dealing with real behaviors that you're observing and you're exposing in the whole process. And so I understand that there are systemic issues and questions and that sort of thing, but to get away from the specifics and the actual logistics of what you're doing, I think is a huge mistake.
Great. Go for it.
Hi. My question is, I'll be very interested to know, what are the law enforcement agencies are doing? What are the main barriers for them to go after reporting entities who are laundering money or who have been charged or have suspicious activity reported, but nothing has happened? And number two, do you think reputational risk for bigger banks, do you think it's a myth?
Is this for anyone in particular or just for the whole panel?
It's for the whole panel.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Jonathan, why don't you start and we'll go down the line.
With law enforcement, I think there's probably not enough in terms of what is understood at the local law enforcement level in order to enforce the sanctions that we have in terms of being able to identify the challenges, to be able to identify the tells. And so I think that there is an education process that needs to take place. It's not to say that it's completely absent, but I think that there's a lot of work to be done at that grassroots level in combating illicit finance. I think probably, Gretchen, you may have a few other thoughts on that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I have a feeling you've worked on some of these things. The reputational risk is actually the thing that I think Treasury has really excelled at. In recent years, this idea of, for example, I mean, I keep coming back to Turkey. This is an area that's near and dear to me now with the amount of time I've put into it. But for example, the state-owned Halk Bank was intimately involved in the Gas for Gold scheme, that $15 billion scheme. And you know, we know that Treasury officials and others paid multiple visits to the Turks, letting them know that there was significant reputational risk. Now, I don't know ultimately whether they prevailed or not, but it's these kinds of visits, again, this kind of below-the-radar approach is ultimately what has dissuaded a lot of companies to stop working with the Iranians at the height of the sanctions campaign. It's what has prevented a lot of illicit finance activity from taking place, and it's just basically premised on this very simple idea that financial institutions can't afford that kind of risk, that reputation actually does matter in our formal financial sector, and so the Treasury has been very effective in that regard.
Tom?
I'd say on a law enforcement angle, from my dealings with law enforcement agencies, I think you see a problem over and over again, which sort of long predates this conversation, where sort of bad actors are constantly looking for a new angle that may be a loophole in the sanctions regime or maybe a loophole in the existing laws on the books, and they're scrambling to find ways to sort of put new pressure to close that loophole. That's sort of the main thing I've seen law enforcement officials struggle with over and over again. This goes back to the days, if you think about it, with the mob, you know, even in this country with Al Capone, where they eventually got him on, you know, tax evasion because the laws on the books weren't strong enough to basically take down his whole network of illicit activity. And I think that's basically the same struggle you see today with a lot of these bad actors, whether it be gold for cash or any of these other things. They're constantly looking for loopholes, and law enforcement agencies are constantly trying to update their analysis and figure out how the laws match reality or don't.
Gretchen?
I would just make the comment that I think that the U.S. has a 19th century structured bureaucracy fighting against 21st century adversaries. We stovepipe authorities to go after certain crimes to specific agencies, whether it's the DEA or Treasury or HSI or ATF, you know, and you don't ever see, you know, a drug trafficker in Afghanistan go, this Al-Qaeda guy doesn't have the authorities to carry my dope. He's a terrorist, right? They're all working together, and yet we bring information to American law enforcement agencies about certain wildlife traffickers, and they go, well, this is great, but you know, we don't have the authorities to go after wildlife trafficking. And I go, but he's not a wildlife trafficker. He's a drug trafficker. I just happen to have heard about him because we're looking at his wildlife crimes, but his, you know, that's the least of his misdoings. And there's this kind of mentality that I think there's a mentality, but there are also legal authorities that limit the U.S. government's capacity to react swiftly in many cases, and we need to do more to get around that and to equip our law enforcement agencies with the capacity to move swiftly against organizations that are going to change their behavior in order to evade and get around our laws.
Great. Next question.
Thank you. I'm Rafi Danziger, now consultant to APAC. And my question relates to Qatar. And I've seen two schools of thought about what's going on there. After all those years in which Qatar has supported all kind of jihadist organizations, some people say that now because of Saudi influence, Qatar has seen the light, and now they've changed the behavior, and they're now on board with the other Gulfies and with Egypt and the others. And another school of thought says that they've made some good statements, they're going through the motions, but basically nothing has changed and is like to change. I'd like to hear the opinion of the panel on that.
Who is this directed to?
Should be you.
Yeah. Well, I can jump in, but does anyone?
Go ahead, you start.
Well, it's a very interesting time in Qatar right now, because I was actually there in November, which was sort of at the tail end of this intense pressure on Qatar from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, some of these other Gulf states to really kind of knock it off, particularly with the support of the Muslim Brotherhood and some of these other great groups. I mean, there are heaps of stories of just whether it was Libyan rebels, almost the Islamist ones, the Syrian ones, just coming into Doha and getting cash kind of at hotels and leaving, or the other way, it's Qatari officials going to the battlefield and bringing arms and cash. Actually, the day I was there, the foreign minister flew to Jeddah for this meeting with King Abdullah, and they basically agreed to bury the hatchet to some degree. And the pressure on them from the Gulfies seemed to abate a little bit, but I just think it's really early days right now. There was a huge bust up last week between the Egyptians and the Qataris, or the Qataris publicly criticized the Egyptians for bombing Islamic State targets inside Libya in retaliation for the murder of these 21 Copt Christians. And it feels like there's still a lot of discord. The GCC first came out and supported Qatar and then flipped around and said they didn't. So I think it's just that leadership in Qatar, I think, is still very much kind of tied into this belief that they are on the cutting edge of the Arab Spring, that their ties to Islamist groups, to Hamas, is going to make them kind of the leader with their money, and there's a lot of pushback. I don't think it's really been decided yet. I think the politics are still playing out, and I guess what to me was the most complex is the emir, the young emir who's just 34, who's meeting with the president today. That the hope or the perception was that he was going to be, that a lot of this kind of tied into his father or to the former foreign minister as far as supporting for the Islamist groups, and he was going to try to moderate it. I mean, we've heard a lot of stories in recent decades that the younger, the sons would be more moderate, whether it was Assad or Kim Jong-un, and it often hasn't turned out very well. But I think he's only been in power now for a little, not even 2 years. I think it's still playing out, and I think what I felt there is that country is so young. They have so much money. You just don't get the sense that they really have control over it, and they don't have the institutions. I mean, I think there is some of it is sympathy for, Sunnis getting killed in Syria or Libya, but I also got the sense this country has so much money, they don't really have the checks and balances to institute policies that maybe some of the leaders do. So that's where I really think it sits.
Well, I think they definitely have the checks. I just don't know if they have the balances. Look, I mean, taking just a step back, I was in Qatar about a year and a half ago, and I remember everybody telling me that things were changing, that Tamim was going to herald in some sort of a new era. I don't see it yet. I don't. Obviously, we continue to see Hamas support. on a significant level. And of course, the Qataris don't recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, but I mean, we can be clear that it's still a violent organization, regardless of what the Qataris might say. It's still the home of Khalid Meshal, Izzat Reshek, the spokesman for Hamas, and others. There was that attempt earlier this summer of the Qataris to transfer $60 million through the Arab Bank. The Arab Bank was, of course, a little skittish at the time. They were still awaiting judgment, a trial here in the United States, and ultimately that cash didn't get through. But you see a consistent effort on top of the $400 million that the former emir brought to the Gaza Strip. He's actually the only world leader to have visited Hamas-controlled Gaza. But that's only part of it. I mean, there is a terrific report put out by FDD's David Andrew Weinberg looking at the various jihadi financiers, Al-Qaeda as well as ISIS, people who were designated here in the United States who've gone back to Qatar and have not been imprisoned. They are roaming free to this day. And it does raise a lot of questions about whether the Qataris take our process seriously. And that also includes, by the way, UN designations. And these are designations that, at least on paper, the Qataris should be beholden to. We continue to hear of stories of cash being trucked into Turkey and then brought over to the border into Syria. We also continue to hear about cash being brought into Libya as well. And for the really long view of things, and I think most people forget this, but Khalid Sheikh Mohammed made Qatar his home for some time, and he was protected by the Qataris. And when the United States was prepared to actually to capture him, he was tipped off by the Qatari government. And so you get a sense that what we're dealing with here is a systemic problem in Qatar. Yes, they are allies of ours on paper in terms of our coalition strikes against ISIS. We've got our Al Udeid base, our forward base for CENTCOM is based in Qatar, but I think that at the end of the day, the United States has a real policy problem. My hope is that these are the sorts of things that are going to be discussed at the White House today with Tamim's visit, but I think that all too often we have kicked the can down the road on Qatar.
Please.
Hi, I'm Matt Levitt with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a proud member of the board of this new center, so congratulations on putting this together. Fantastic stuff. 40,000-foot question. As financial tools have been made a critical part of the national security toolkit, I think we're increasingly seeing a tension, and I'd like any of you to answer how you think we should navigate this tension. On the one hand, this is a tool of high policy. Russia is not behaving, so maybe we'll have more sanctions. Things with Iran don't go well, so we'll have any of a variety type of sanctions, North Korea, et cetera. But on the flip side, it's also an issue of a kind of a technocratic effort in targeting specific illicit behaviors. So problems comes up when, for example, we then remove North Korea from the FTO list, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, but not for anything having to do with terrorism, but because we wanted to bring them back to the six-party talks. Or, for example, now, if negotiations with Iran succeed, Iran wants to be removed from all sanctions lists, but most of the sanctions lists, or many of them anyway, don't have anything to do with sanctions, with the proliferation that is. They have to do with terrorism, they have to do with money laundering, illicit finance, they have to do with human rights. So how do you balance and navigate that problem?
Great question. Tom, you want to start?
Well, I think actually that's probably the key issue in terms of the efficacy of sanctions is they have to be part of a whole diplomatic effort and a whole government effort when you're moving forward with this. When you talk about Iran, for example, we talked about this earlier, where I think one of the big mistakes in the negotiations with Iran is this sort of cleaving where the nuclear program sits over here and everything else is taken off the table and is treated as separate. When, as you rightly point out, a lot of the sanctions against Iran have to do with everything else. And of course, the Iranians want all that swept under the rug as they push forward with the deal. So I think that sort of shows the gap, I think, between sort of a sort of very narrow-minded focus on one part of the problem and not the whole problem. I think sanctions can be used to illuminate a regime behavior and some of the bad actors we're dealing with around the world, and hopefully can be used to sort of guide even policymakers on this stuff. But I don't think too often times they take that into account.
Gretchen?
I guess my thought on this is that it is going to be challenging in a diplomatic situation where you have a country like Iran or an organization like the Taliban wanting a grand bargain and wanting everything to be swept under the rug, all or nothing, a sort of maximalist stance. that's going to be challenging, and I think that it is important. It is important to see the larger picture and not to try and divide up what's the various reasons why the sanctions exist and the various individuals and entities within any problem set that are being addressed by different sanctions.
Jonathan.
Look, I would just say this, that the goal of sanctions is not to provide a tool to allow the United States government or any other to start negotiating. The goal of sanctions should be to safeguard the U.S.-backed financial system, right? This is to protect the integrity of the U.S. financial system and the systems of its allies. And so I think we've actually seen time and again, whether it's North Korea or I think now with the challenges that await us with regard to Iran. I mean, look, the Iran scenario is a great scenario. Let's say they come to the table and let's say they finally do ink a deal with the United States and the P5+1. That's not going to solve the problem of Hezbollah finance, of Hamas finance. It's not going to solve the problem of the human rights sanctions that we've put in place or any of the other issues that we've flagged the Iranians for. And so what are we going to say? We're just going to remove all the sanctions because of this one good faith effort? It is highly problematic. It's going to leave our financial system exposed. And you know, on that level, I think we do have to raise the question, should we allow our diplomats to use our sanction system as leverage? And I think it's a real conundrum. I think we're going to see it again very soon.
I mean, I'm just going to add a little bit. I find it hard. If the Iranians get a deal that's going to be perceived as pretty weak, which is, you know, there's a lot of sides to that, and they could sort of weather what I would say was almost a perfect storm. It's hard for me to see another country getting hit by the U.S. as hard as the Iranians have over the past, 5 or 6 years. You just had this perfect storm between the Europeans getting fed up, Ahmadinejad, Holocaust. If these guys kind of get through it and get a deal that's pretty favorable to them, I just wonder if the fear of these financial penalties will kind of diminish. Please. I can't see.
I can see something more on Qatar if you want.
I'm sure you could.
Thank you. Yeah, Abe Shulsky from Hudson. There was a report this morning, I have no way of knowing whether or not it's true, that Qatar might be paying the ransom amount for some Lebanese soldiers that had been captured by Syrian rebels, probably Nusra. And that raises the whole question of do these sanction regimes look at the whole issue of ransom payments to terrorist groups? Because among other things, I mean, you could have ransom payments that are really just ransom payments. Some government wants to get its citizens back. But you could also use this as a way of financing terrorism without taking the reputational hit. And I was wondering whether that was part of the what you look at.
Okay.
Sure.
This is a great question. The actually, what Nusra Front has been doing in Syria has been holding various hostages, and instead of doing the grotesque beheading videos and that sort of thing, they have a very lucrative trade where Qatar is the broker for these hostage, basically getting the hostages freed, whether it be UN fighters or others in the country. And there's a deep suspicion, and in fact, I think a lot of intelligence officials would think this is what's going on, that it's used precisely for the reason you just identified, was it's a cover for basically a way to finance these guys. And so you'll notice that very early on in the reporting, it's always, oh, no hostage payment was rendered for the freeing the hostages by Al-Qaeda in Syria, which is, of course, nonsense. Well, why would they be holding them and entering in negotiations unless they're going to get something out of it? And, of course, they are getting something out of it. And so when you go back, for example, the UN peacekeepers who were held hostage last year by Nusra, there was, I think, 40-some odd of them were held hostage by Nusra Front. And, in fact, Qatar was the one that actually brokered the freeing of them. There's a deep suspicion that they got into millions of dollars easily for their freedom.
Does anyone else want to hit that?
I can actually just say that this is nothing new. When I used to watch Libya under Gaddafi, he used to pay for the ransom of people who were captured by Abu Sayyaf and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and this was a way of essentially just sending money to them. And so it was kind of a scam. I think it continues to be one, and it's sort of an interesting thing to see that these things just get recycled, you know, one terrorist generation after another.
I also think with Qatar in particular, the U.S. policy is very vague. We use Qatar as a broker. We certainly did with Bergdahl and the Taliban. And there's, you know, the Treasury is screaming about financing of Hamas by Qatar, but the U.S. government uses the Qatari foreign minister as a channel to Khalid Mashal all the time. So if you're the Qatari government, I don't know how you change. You're getting the best words. You're kind of enhancing your power in the region, and you're cultivating groups or, you know, entities that are basically also help your position in the region.
Just let me add one quick point on that, and I think that's exactly right. I think what Qatar can do in particular is, and this is the ultimate tell in all this, is that we know that people, the Qataris know about this, everybody knows about this, are financing Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda actors and that sort of thing. To then see them involved in this sort of exchange, well, we already know they're flowing money in other reasons, for other reasons too, Al-Qaeda in Syria. Why do we treat this as something separate from that sort of activity?
Great. Well, I think we are just up at, are we there? Great. Well, this has been a great discussion. I appreciate it, everyone, and thanks for coming, and we'll move on. Thanks a lot.